Warning, the video you're about to watch contains footage of a video game whose developers decided it would be a great idea to put ridiculous amounts of bloom lighting in there. So what that means is that it's constantly blinding the player with these really bright lights. So if you're at all sensitive to bright light, I recommend not watching this video, because I'm not all that sensitive to bright light, and even then I got pretty massive headaches from this thing just from the bloom lighting. So that should tell you something right off the bat. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. That was a pretty unusual intro, huh? This is my review of Syndicate, the Reboot, that was done by Starbreeze Studios and published by EA for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3 in February of 2012. And it's basically got nothing to do gameplay-wise with the original two games, which are Syndicate and Syndicate Wars. Instead, it takes a lot of the source material in terms of its themes, in terms of just the names and things like that, and some of the core ideas, and transplants them into a first-person shooter. And so I went into this thing knowing it wasn't going to be much of anything like the original games. And so, what happened? How did it turn out? Is it as bad as people act like it is? Because a lot of people hate this game because it's not like the original Syndicate games. But how is it just by itself as its own game? Now, I've already mentioned part of the presentation as being particularly problematic, which is the bloom lighting, but let's go more in depth with that and talk more about what this thing actually does in terms of its presentation, aside from blind you constantly. Well, in terms of the visuals, it doesn't look bad, nor does it look particularly good. Now, in terms of it not looking bad, it's because they had a very nice art style going on with this thing, where it's this very nice corporate style to it, where everything is kind of clean and almost too clean in a lot of ways, at least until you show up and start destroying the place. So that's pretty cool, actually, and there's a lot of nice effects here and there. The texture quality is not particularly great. It's about average, I would say, and the animations in first person anyway are not particularly good either. They're not even really average, they're on the mediocre side. But characters moving around and such like that look fine, and like I said, there's a lot of nice effects in there to make this thing feel very sci-fi, cyberpunk-esque. And it has a very clear visual style that sets it apart from pretty much everything else out there. That said, it constantly blinds you with the frickin' bloom lighting, and if it's not blinding you with the bloom lighting, it's blurring your screen like crazy because they seem to think motion blur is there for the moments that aren't going to blind you with the bloom lighting. It's ridiculous and kind of nauseating at times. So not only are you getting blinded by the bloom lighting and getting massive headaches from that, but you're also getting nauseated from the motion blur that's going on in such a strong manner. And it's ridiculous. Now on PC you can actually do some modding in order to get the motion blur and the bloom lighting to not be quite as ridiculously nauseating or headache inducing, but it only helps so much because they really did put some ridiculously strong effects on that in here, and I really can't figure out why they decided to do that. Now the one thing they didn't screw up was at least 2/3 of the sound design. The other third being the horrible soundtrack, which consists of basically nothing but dubstep, which is not music, it's just noise, and I hate it. But apart from that, you have absolutely fantastic sound effects, and they reverberate throughout the entirety of the environments. They are very beefy and concussive, and you feel like there's a lot of force behind everything. And so all of the sound effects are brilliant in this game, and the voice acting is also very good. They actually got some pretty high-name actors in here to actually do some of the voice acting. For example, the CEO of Eurocorp in this game is played by Brian Cox, who's a pretty well-known actor. Now, I wouldn't say it's the best performances in the world, but it's certainly pretty high quality, and they've done a pretty good job with what they've got. It's just a shame that what they've got to work with isn't exactly the best material on the planet. Which leads me to the most important part of this game, the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Eurocorp agent Miles Kylo, who has been equipped with the new prototype Dart 6 neural chip, which gives him all sorts of really cool abilities that I'll get to more in the gameplay. But the idea is that he, like every other agent for every corporation in this universe, is there to do the dirty work of the corporation, to basically wage this secret war between the corporations, or syndicates, if you will. So the story starts out with you going off to kill the counterpart of the scientist who installs the chip in your brain, and you basically find out that she was actually betraying Eurocorp to help him out, and all sorts of ridiculous things from there happen. You don't really care what the story is. It's pretty predictable. It's basically the whole, the corporations are doing horrible things, and I was just this scientist who was so idealistic and naive, and we have to stop them from being evil bastards. That's pretty much the entire plot in a nutshell right there. It's really predictable, and the ending just leaves you going, wait, what? Did you seriously go for this cliched crap? There's really nothing all that memorable about it in terms of its plot or characters. Nobody's really anything more than one or two notes, and you don't really have any complexities to the characters that aren't incredibly cliched. The character you're playing as has literally no personality whatsoever. He never speaks at all the entire game. And when you're dealing with all these other characters who are pretty much just cardboard cutouts rather than actual characters, it gets old pretty quick. So you lose interest in the story and the characters almost immediately, actually, and you start to focus more on the gameplay. This is where things get really interesting, because this doesn't do the typical first-person shooter thing. Well, not entirely. You do have a 2-weapon limit, you do have a button for grenades, you don't automatically throw them, you just whip them out, and then you can throw them if you want. Or you can switch back to your weapons. So, you do have to constantly switch weapons as you need them throughout the levels, where you'll have to pick up some heavy weapon or something like that in order to defeat certain enemies, or go through certain obstacles or things like that. You still have some missions where there's these arbitrary walls to your progress that you have to wait for somebody to open a door first, or something like that. It's extremely linear and pretty short, clocking in at about 5 to 6 hours maybe, with many of the levels being outright narrow hallways with not a lot of cover, and those environments that do open up more are certainly pretty well detailed, and they actually have some pretty nice set pieces here and there, but you really can't escape the feeling that this is a modern FPS by the numbers, at least in terms of its general design. Where things get interesting, though, is in the particulars. While you do have a 2-weapon limit, each weapon has multiple fire modes. For example, the pistol, which is surprisingly versatile, has both the semi-automatic and a 3-round burst mode. But from there, things get more and more interesting. For example, you have your typical shotgun, you have an assault rifle, in fact a couple of them, you have a sniper rifle, things like that. But the shotgun has a secondary fire where it basically shoots incendiary rounds. The assault rifle, there's 2 of them, one of them has a grenade launcher mounted on it. The other one has a fire mode where it fires semi-automatic, but it fires what it calls overpressured rounds that will actually go through walls and things like that. And since you have the dart vision mode, you can actually see through walls, so it's pretty useful. Sniper rifle, you can switch between a scope and a red dot sight to make things easier up close. It's got some pretty interesting weaponry here. Although, probably the most interesting one is the Gauss rifle, which is basically a fully automatic rifle, but the bullets curve. You can lock onto a target, and then you can fire bullets around obstacles at them. It's a really cool idea, and it's really cool to see it in action. It's not a particularly powerful weapon compared to some of the others, but it's pretty cool how they pull stuff like this off. And so the arsenal, despite having a lot of kind of samey stuff to what you're used to, still manages to make itself feel unique because of this different flair that they've put on all of the weaponry. And then there's the part of the game where you can use the Dart 6 chip in your head to manipulate things in the environment and basically hack into people's chips and mess their heads up. For example, you can hack into enemies' chips and cause them to basically blast themselves apart, or hack into enemies' chips in order to pull them over to your side for a while, and eventually they just die from enemy fire or they end up killing themselves. And then there's another one that allows you to basically make things backfire on them, and it knocks them over and does some damage to them. And it can affect multiple targets. And things like that. And you basically just hold down the E button and until you get to a certain point. You can either let the bar fill up, or you can get into the zone like you would in, say, Gears of War when you're reloading or something like that. And it basically just instantly fires off instead of having to fill up the rest of the bar. So that's pretty cool, and it works rather well, actually. There are certain enemies that you can't do that to, and for example, they'll have this kind of crystalline armor that molds around them and basically makes them immune to damage, except from really heavy weapons. And you can actually use the breaching mechanic, it's called breaching in this game, where you will make their armor crystallize, and thus you can actually do damage to them now. And so they do throw in some different ideas compared to pretty much every other FPS out there, and it's well appreciated. This thing actually ends up setting itself apart from pretty much everything else on the market. It's just that it's kind of inconsistent when it actually comes to playing the thing. On the one hand, most of the enemies are actually fairly easy to take out. You can just walk up to them and melee them to death instantly, because when you get within range to do a melee attack, it basically is just an instant execution during which you take no damage whatsoever, so makes things a bit easy. Now that doesn't work so much on, say, the guys who have the crystalline armor or the heavy troopers or things like that, but you do have some pretty easy fights in this thing, and when you get your hands on a minigun, you're basically an unstoppable juggernaut of death. They do also try to spice things up by giving you fights against other agents who have special abilities that make them much harder to take down than your typical grunt, and it basically ends up being the boss fights of the game. And they certainly do spice things up, but they feel like they drag on for a bit, because those enemies are pretty much just bullet sponges on top of having those special abilities, so that can get kind of annoying, but they're certainly nice to give you an actual challenge compared to all the grunts, at least. That's not to say that every single fight is ridiculously easy. I have died several times in this game, usually when I just get swarmed by lots of enemies at once, or by the heavy troopers or something like that. But it's not really because the enemies outsmarted me or things like that. It's because they got lucky and I got stuck on an object or out of cover, and they just gunned me down like it was nothing or something like that. So the AI is really not all that great in this game. They will take cover, they will throw a lot of grenades at you, which, funnily enough, you can actually disarm and then pick them back up to use as your own grenades, which is really fun. But by and large, the enemies don't really exhibit a lot of intelligence. They just kind of stay in cover, or they'll move out of cover to shoot at you for a bit and don't really hit you all that much unless you get to the later levels in the game, really. And it really seems more like enemies are bullet spongy rather than actually difficult to kill. So what you end up with here is an FPS that has some really cool weapons in it. It has a pretty cool breaching mechanic that changes things up considerably from most other games out there. And due to the sound effects and the gore effects and things like that, the combat ends up being pretty visceral and, for a while at least, entertaining. But you can't really shake the feeling that this is just not a particularly great game. It's not bad, but it's not particularly great either. It's kind of a decent distraction. If you like FPSs, you'll probably find something to like about it, once you get past the ridiculous bloom lighting and motion blur effects anyway. But if you're a fan of the original Syndicate or Syndicate Wars, I would say avoid it. There's really nothing here for you. It just feels like a fairly average FPS that just happened to have the Syndicate name tacked on it, and thus will have a pretty extreme reaction from the Syndicate fans for not really being what they wanted from another Syndicate game. But for those out there who hadn't played the original Syndicate before they played this, it's just a fairly average quality FPS that might be worth it if you get it for maybe $5-10 or something like that. As long as you get it on sale, I can't really say that it's a bad purchase, unless you just really, really hate bloom lighting and motion blur. I give it a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.